When I was a child, my family often spent the weekends or the holidays at my grandmother's house. As a typical traditional Malay house, the house was made of wood and pretty big. Not a surprise though, since my father does have a lot of siblings, 9 of them in total. But it wasn't just my immediate family. Most weekends or holidays, even my uncles and aunt will be there too long with their family. Sometimes there will be around 50 to 70 of us inside this house, in fact. It was truly one of the fondest memories where the entire huge family would sit together to have dinner or celebrate birthdays and whatnot. And generally, it was just a really great time. One day, though, my grandmother, she fell sick. The doctor simply told us that her health was deteriorating since she was pretty old at that time, but didn't require hospitalization at that point. My dad and his siblings all made up their mind that my grandmother should stay with them. Every month, she'll stay with one of her children's houses, and I remember she stayed the most at my house since it was the biggest at the time. I was honestly happy since she was a great storyteller and also a great cook. In the meantime, my father and uncles hired a nearby neighbor to take care of and clean my grandmother's house every once in a while. Unfortunately, though, her health continues to decline. She told my father that she wants to stay in her old home. At first, we didn't really like the idea, with her being alone in that house, especially with her declining health. But after a lot of discussion, my eldest uncle decided to build a house directly in front of my grandmother's house to stay. In the meantime, they'll rent a nearby house so he and my cousins could visit her every day. My father and his siblings also agreed to hire a nanny for my grandmother so she won't be alone. Fortunately too, despite no one having stayed in the house for about 2 years to this point, the house was relatively clean. Now, it had been probably about a week since my grandmother returned to her own house. The weekend was coming up though, and my father decided to bring back the tradition of staying at my grandmother's. That Friday night, around maybe 20 of us were there, I think. And it was that night that strange things began to happen. The first to notice something was off were my cousins. They were all the daughters of Dad's youngest sibling. They were always cheerful, but at that time, I just remember their faces were almost terrified all the time. I just chalked it up to kids being kids, which was kind of ironic since I was around 10 at the time. But then, as I walked past their bedroom, I heard through the thin wall that the girls complained to their parents that they noticed a few shadowy figures had been all over the house. My uncle tried to convince them that it was just their imagination. I decided not to care much since I was just too tired and sleepy. But that night, while I was sleeping, I remember waking up and staring above, and I saw something that I'll never forget. Just so you know too, a traditional Malay house rarely has a ceiling in the first place. The house beam was exposed and you can see the inside layer of the roof. And during my sudden awakening, I saw something like a shadow sitting at the house beam. I had to rub my eyes to see, and after a while I sort of could make out what it was. It was a creature or something. I thought to myself at first, am I still dreaming? I was pretty terrified, but I could definitely see something there, but it was like my brain was failing to see exactly what it looked like. What I mean by this is that sometimes it sort of looked like maybe a lion or then a crocodile or something, and then it would sort of switch to a huge bird or something else. But then it looked at me, and all I remember were its huge red eyes and a huge wide grin filled with teeth. It was at this point too that I tried to scream my lungs out, but my voice stuck at my throat and my body felt stiff, like I was paralyzed. All I could do in the end was slowly pull up the blanket and hide my body underneath it and try and force myself back to sleep, hoping that the whole thing was just a nightmare or something. The next day, I simply sat alone at the stairs trying to get rid of the memories of what happened and process the whole event. But from the corner of my eye, I could sense that someone or something had been peeking around from the toilet area, looking at the living room. It looks as if it was a child or simply the size of a child anyway, with sort of pale grey skin. Again, too, at first, I just thought it was my imagination, but it happened throughout the day and the nights, and then I heard my aunts talking with each other, and it turns out that I wasn't the only one who noticed it, because apparently the entire family had seen it. Or rather, we could only see it out of the corner of our eyes, but when we all tried to turn to look at it directly, it just simply disappeared. Some people as well decided to check it out themselves, and yet there was always nothing there. My uncle quietly told us one day, though, that when a house was abandoned for too long, there's always something that tends to move in. The house was abandoned for about 2 years before this, so obviously something had come in, and now it felt like we were all simply the intruders. He told us that if we didn't bother them, that they shouldn't bother us. That night we all prayed together as well as recited some holy prayers, and yet I could still see this little stalker, and I was beginning to notice a few shadows around the house that didn't belong to the furniture or the stuff in there. Worse for me, though, was that night. I had woken up again. This time, this thing was already grinning at me, with what I assumed the hand poking my cheek this time. It was a really weird sensation too, because it didn't feel solid at all. It almost felt more like a cloud of smoke sort of brushing up against me. Again, I tried to scream, but my body felt stiff. Like before, I could only slowly pull up my blanket to cover my head and force myself to sleep, but I didn't dare to sleep at that house ever again after that. In fact, every time we went back to my grandmother's house during either weekends or holidays, I would simply choose to stay at my uncle's house that was right in front of it. But every time I entered that house, I could still sense this small figure poking out its head from the toilet wall, or the shadows that would move around the house just all over the place. My grandmother passed away around 8 years ago, and since then we have just never had a reason to stay at that house ever again. The house was downsized as well while I was at university, but it still has the original layout of the lower area and whatnot. They only got rid of the upper area, in other words. I asked my father too one day why he didn't simply just demolish the entire building and start again, and he then told me that even getting rid of the upper area was difficult, because workers apparently were being pushed by nothing, and electronics and engines were always malfunctioning, and in the end they just decided not to touch the bottom area and just use it as storage. Around the turn of the millennium, my significant other and I used to belong to a group of tight friends that would hug and kiss each other when we would meet and say goodbye. Time passes, and some of our closest friends start hanging out with a couple of guys. One of them called John, not his real name obviously, who tagged along for a few visits to my place and became strangely eager to get hugs too when I was greeting my friends. When I would hug my friends goodbye and not him, he would even ask to get hugged. For instance, when I would hug my friends goodbye and not him, he would even ask to get hugged also, which I found strange, but would have been okay with if I didn't find his hugs both creepy and draining. I found it just so uncomfortable to have him in my space that I specifically asked my friends to stop giving me hugs when we met with him around, because he was just so slimy, and I didn't want him in my personal space with his bad juju. It even reached a point where I asked my friends not to bring him over to our house, which they thought was rather bitchy of me, but there was something just really off-putting about him that I did not want around me or in my home. I just couldn't put my finger on it, though. Anyway, a couple of years pass, and my partner and I are no longer a part of the group anymore. Not least because we thought that they'd gone on a bit of a shady path while getting closer to John and his best friend. But we simply didn't like those new friends, and especially John, who had demonstrated a few times how unethical his thought process was. Then, just out of the blue, comes this huge story on the news in February of 2004 about a body being found by accident in the harbour of a very small town way up north. But there had been a series of bad storms, and during one of them a trawler had accidentally crashed into the pier, so they called in a driver to assess the damage. During that dive, the diver comes across a man's body wrapped in clear plastic and chains to weigh him down. A foul play obviously assumed. It was a very unique story in my small and very peaceful country. A few days pass, and the police managed to put together a sketch of the dead man, who was assumed to be of Eastern European descent, asking people to contact the authorities if they had any information. A few more weeks pass, and meanwhile a lot of speculation and tidbits of information come out on the media, which I'm honestly relying on here to give an accurate account of what transpired. An autopsy of the body, though, revealed that the body contained 61 packages of amphetamines, some of which had reached the small intestine, where a few packages seemed to have ruptured. The police give out a statement that they've managed to track the owners of the vehicle that had been seen lingering on the pier a few days before the body was found, and a week later the whole story is published in the local media. 3 men were under arrest for trying to smuggle dope into the country using a drug mule who had swallowed the drugs but couldn't pass them. The man had tried to pick the mule up at the main airport, where one of them went to the arrivals holding up a sign with his name, but somehow missed him, and instead they picked him up at the bus terminal in town and took him to their flat, where he was supposed to deliver the packages through the usual channels. But obviously nothing came out. After they took the drug mule to their apartment, he lay there for a few days in just excruciating pain, unable to deliver the goods, while none of them wanted to take him to the hospital. According to the confession, he himself was adamant not to go to the ER because then he'd both be in trouble with the law and the Lithuanian mafia that had partially funded this ill-fated trip. Additionally, they'd given him morphine-based painkillers, but didn't realize that it actually slows down digestion, which further added to this man's troubles. When they realize that the drugs are not coming out, they come up with the solution to send him back to Lithuania and drive him halfway to the airport, but are forced to return when he starts throwing up blood and claims that he was too ill to fly. And so, back to the apartment they go to wait it out. The waiting game ends when some of the packages seem to have ruptured in the man's small intestine, and he passes away, unfortunately, without delivering the goods. And so the guy is now dead, and the 3 geniuses decide to dump his body. They came up with the ingenious idea to drive to the hometown where one of them was raised way up north, a route that takes 8 hours in best conditions, where their plan was to weigh the body down and dump it in the harbour where he wouldn't be found again. They wrap the body up in a plastic tarp and a rug and stuff him into the truck of their Jeep, and while the local guy flies to his mum up north, his 2 friends start driving off in the dead of winter to find that safe place where they can dump the body. Off they drive without paying attention to the weather warnings of severe Arctic snowstorms that are about to hit the country. As expected, a blizzard hits their travel route, so they're forced to seek shelter and overnight in a tiny town where their only accommodation was this tiny hotel that, by coincidence, is located next to the local police station. For 2 whole nights, too, their small Jeep is parked next to the local police vehicles with a dead body in the trunk. The blizzards let up, so they venture on and finally reach the guy's hometown, where they get snowed in again, still with the body in the trunk. The local guy shows them around this small town, and off they go next to the right harbour, where they manage to weigh the body down with the chains and bobbings, and the local guy stabs the body a few times so the intestinal gases don't make the body float up. On the pier, they have a heated discussion about whether to cut the body open to get the drugs out, the driver arguing for it with the locals strictly against it, refusing to do more of the dirty work. That dark night, they dumped the poor man's body into the freezing ocean before spending 2 extra nights snowed in at the local's mum's house. She noted during the interrogation that she'd been so happy to get a surprise visit from him and his friends, and even happier when the weather kept them longer. Eventually, the snowstorm lets up though, so they're able to drive back home, again being forced to overnight once on the way due to the bad weather conditions. The day after they leave town, a ship accidentally crashes into the pier in the town, so a driver has to go down to take a look, and lo and behold, he finds the body wrapped in chains and clear plastic. Somebody remembers that a grey Jeep had been standing on the pier a few nights before, and since it was a small town, it didn't take long for the cops to find out whose car it was and trace the owner. 3 men are arrested and are shown on the news. And you probably guessed it by now, but one of them being John, that I hadn't wanted to hug because he was just too creepy. It was a total validation of all of my spidey senses, that's for sure. During the investigation too, and interrogations, John was the only one who constantly tried to lie his way out of it, while his two partners came clean about what they had done, aside from naming their Lithuanian drug connections. John was also the one that drove to the airport and held up the sign with the guy's name, and he was the one that drove north and wanted to retrieve the drugs out of the dead body. A really classy guy, right? All of them went to jail, thankfully, but John the liar got the heaviest sentence because he lied to the police and continued lying to the judge. They were sentenced for drug smuggling, not aiding a person in need, for being guilty of desecrating a body but deemed innocent of manslaughter. I believe that they spent several years in jail and a while on probation too. This whole story is actually really famous in my country, and the police reports honestly read like pure fiction. It's a great example of truth being stranger than fiction, and also served as proof to me that I should always trust my senses.